When 7-year-old Emma vanished into a deadly blizzard, search parties told her parents that no child could survive the night in those conditions. 18 hours later, the wild mare that the entire town had feared for years walked out of the frozen forest with the little girl alive at her side. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The valley of Willowbrook lay nestled between ancient mountains that had stood watch over the land for countless generations. It was a place where winter came early and stayed long, where the snow blanketed everything in a silence so profound that one could hear their own heartbeat echoing through the frozen trees. In this remote corner of Montana, where civilization felt like a distant memory and the wilderness reigned supreme, there lived a 7-year-old girl named Emma, whose life was about to change in ways no one could have ever predicted. Emma was small for her age, with chestnut hair that her mother braided every morning before school, and eyes the color of warm honey that seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond her years. She lived with her parents in a modest farmhouse at the edge of the valley where her father worked as a logger and her mother taught at the small schoolhouse 3 miles down the winding road. Their life was simple but filled with love, and Emma had grown up surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that city children only read about in storybooks. But there was something different about Emma, something that set her apart from the other children in Willowbrook. While they played games and chased each other through the snow, Emma preferred the company of animals. She would spend hours watching the deer that grazed at the edge of the forest, leaving them apples she had saved from her lunch. She fed the wild birds that visited her windowsill each morning, learning their songs and giving each one a name. Her parents often remarked that their daughter had a gift, an ability to connect with creatures in a way that seemed almost magical. It was on a bitter November afternoon that Emma first saw her. She had wandered farther than usual into the meadow behind their property, following the tracks of a rabbit she hoped to befriend, when movement at the tree line caught her attention. There, standing like a ghost against the dark pines, was the most magnificent creature Emma had ever seen, a mare massive and wild with a coat as white as the snow that surrounded her and a mane that flowed like silver silk in the cold wind. The horse must have stood at least 17 hands high, her powerful body a testament to the untamed spirit that burned within her. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard stories about this horse from the older folks in town. They called her the Ghost of Willowbrook, a wild mare that had roamed these mountains for as long as anyone could remember. Some said she was the descendant of horses that had escaped from a ranch decades ago. Others whispered that she was something more, a spirit of the land itself given form. What everyone agreed upon was that she was dangerous and unpredictable, a creature that wanted nothing to do with humans and would trample anyone foolish enough to approach her. But as Emma stood there, the cold seeping through her winter coat and her small hands trembling inside her mittens, she saw something in the mare's eyes that the townspeople had never mentioned. She saw loneliness. It was a feeling Emma knew all too well, for though her parents loved her dearly, being different from other children had made her an outsider in many ways. She understood what it meant to be feared for being misunderstood, to long for connection while the world kept its distance. The mare snorted, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and Emma expected her to bolt into the forest as all wild things did. Instead, the great white horse simply stood there, watching the little girl with an intensity that felt almost human. For what seemed like an eternity, they remained like that. Two souls separated by species, but connected by something neither could name. Then, slowly, the mare turned and disappeared into the shadows of the pines, leaving Emma alone in the meadow with her heart pounding and her mind racing. That night, Emma could not sleep. She lay in her bed beneath the quilts her grandmother had made, staring at the ceiling while the image of the white mare played over and over in her mind. She thought about those eyes, dark and deep as mountain pools, and the loneliness she had recognized within them. By the time the first light of dawn crept through her window, Emma had made a decision. She would return to that meadow, and she would find a way to help the ghost of Willowbrook. The next day after school, Emma told her mother she was going to play in the yard, a half-truth that sat uneasily in her young heart. Instead, she made her way to the meadow, her backpack stuffed with carrots she had taken from the vegetable drawer and an apple from the fruit bowl. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked, and the cold bit at her cheeks. But she pressed on with a determination that belied her small size. She waited for over an hour, her fingers growing numb and her nose turning red before she finally saw the mare emerge from the trees. The great white horse approached cautiously, her ears flicking back and forth as she assessed the situation. Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain still, remembering how the wild deer had come to trust her only after she had proven she was no threat. Slowly, with movements as gentle as falling snow, Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a carrot. She placed it on the ground in front of her and then took 3 steps back, her eyes never leaving the mare. The horse watched her with suspicion, but curiosity soon won out over fear. She moved forward, her hooves barely making a sound despite her enormous size, and lowered her head to sniff the offering. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature so large, the mare picked up the carrot and ate it. When she finished, she raised her head and looked at Emma, and in that look the little girl saw something new. Not just loneliness, but the first fragile stirrings of trust. From that day forward, Emma's life took on a secret rhythm that she guarded more carefully than any treasure. Every afternoon after school, while her mother prepared dinner and her father was still out working in the forest, Emma would slip away to the meadow with her backpack filled with whatever food she could gather without raising suspicion. Carrots, apples, sugar cubes she had taken from the kitchen cabinet, handfuls of oats she had scooped from the feed bin meant for their neighbors' horses. Each offering was a small gift, a token of friendship extended across the vast divide between human and wild creature. The first few weeks were slow going. The mare would appear at the edge of the trees, watching Emma with those deep, intelligent eyes, but she would not come close. She would wait until the girl had placed the food on the ground and retreated a safe distance before approaching to eat. Emma learned to be patient, to sit quietly in the snow with her hands visible and her movements slow. She talked to the mare in a soft voice, telling her about school and her parents, about the books she loved to read and the dreams she dreamed at night. She did not know if the horse understood her words, but she believed that the mare understood her heart. As November gave way to December and the snows grew deeper, something remarkable began to happen. The mare started coming closer, first by inches, then by feet, until one magical afternoon she stood near enough for Emma to see the individual hairs of her silver mane and the way her breath formed perfect clouds in the frozen air. The little girl's heart nearly burst with joy, but she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that any sudden movement could shatter the trust they had worked so hard to build. That day, for the first time, she decided the mare needed a proper name. She thought about it all the way home, considering and discarding dozens of possibilities before finally settling on one that felt perfect: Luna. Because the mare was as beautiful and mysterious as the moon itself, and because she only seemed to appear when the light was soft and the world was quiet. The days grew shorter and colder, and Emma's secret became harder to keep. Her mother noticed that the carrots were disappearing faster than usual, and that the sugar bowl needed refilling more often than before. Her father remarked that she seemed to spend an awful lot of time playing in the yard for a girl who had never liked the cold. Emma deflected their questions with half-truths and misdirection, feeling guilty for the deception, but unable to bring herself to reveal her precious secret. She knew what would happen if the adults found out. They would forbid her from going to the meadow, They would call the wildlife authorities to come and capture Luna. They would destroy the fragile bond that Emma had worked so tirelessly to create. By Christmas, the relationship between girl and Mare had transformed into something neither had ever experienced before. Luna would now approach Emma without hesitation, lowering her massive head to accept the treats from the girl's small hands. The first time their skin touched, Emma threw her mittens and Luna's soft muzzle pressing against her palm. The little girl cried tears of pure happiness that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. She had never felt so connected to another living being, had never known that such a profound understanding could exist between two creatures so different from one another. Emma began to learn Luna's language, the subtle signs and signals that horses use to communicate. She learned that ears pressed forward meant curiosity, while ears laid back meant fear or anger. She understood that a soft nicker was a greeting and that a stamp of the hoof was a warning. Luna, in turn, seemed to learn Emma's ways. She recognized the sound of the girl's footsteps crunching through the snow and would emerge from the forest before Emma even reached the meadow. She knew the difference between Emma's happy chatter and her sad silences, and on the days when the little girl arrived with tears in her eyes after a difficult day at school, Luna would stand close and let her bury her face in that magnificent silver mane. The townspeople of Willowbrook continued to speak of the ghost with fear and suspicion. Old Tom at the general store told stories of how the mare had chased hunters out of the forest, rearing up on her hind legs and screaming like a demon. Mrs. Patterson from the church swore she had seen the horse standing on the ridge during a thunderstorm, lightning flashing around her like she was some kind of supernatural apparition. Everyone agreed that the ghost was dangerous, that she was a menace that should have been dealt with years ago. Emma listened to these stories with a secret smile, knowing a truth that none of them could imagine. Luna was not a demon or a menace. She was simply lonely, a magnificent creature who had been feared and hunted for so long that she had learned to trust no one, until now. January brought the deepest snows anyone in Willowbrook could remember. The drifts piled higher than Emma's head in places, and her father had to dig a path just to get from the house to the woodshed. School was canceled for days at a time, and Emma's mother kept her close, worried about the bitter cold that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice of their old farmhouse. But Emma found ways to sneak out, even if only for a few minutes at a time. She could not bear the thought of Luna waiting for her in the meadow, wondering why her only friend had abandoned her. On these brief visits, Emma would run through the snow as fast as her short legs could carry her, her backpack bouncing against her back and her breath coming in ragged gasps. Luna always seemed to sense her coming, appearing at the edge of the trees with an urgency that matched Emma's own. They would have only minutes together, precious stolen moments in which Emma would offer whatever food she had managed to bring, and Luna would press her warm nose against the girl's cold face. Then Emma would have to run back home before her mother noticed she was gone, her heart aching with every step that took her farther from her beloved friend. It was during one of these January visits that Emma first touched Luna without her mittens. Her mother had been calling for her, and in her haste to leave, Emma had dropped one of her gloves in the snow. Without thinking, she reached up with her bare hand to stroke Luna's cheek, and the warmth of the mare's skin against her frozen fingers was like nothing she had ever felt. Luna stood perfectly still, her eyes closing in contentment, and in that moment Emma knew with absolute certainty that their bond was something rare and precious, something that would last forever. February arrived with a ferocity that seemed determined to break the spirit of everyone in Willowbrook. The temperatures plummeted to levels that made the old-timers shake their heads in disbelief, and the wind howled through the valley like a living thing, rattling windows and tearing shingles from roofs. Emma's father worked longer hours than ever, cutting and hauling firewood to keep their home warm, while her mother spent her days mending clothes and preparing hearty meals designed to ward off the brutal cold. The whole valley seemed to hunker down, waiting for the worst of winter to pass. But even the harshest weather could not keep Emma from her secret mission. She had become clever in her deceptions, learning exactly when her mother's attention would be elsewhere and how long she could be gone before anyone noticed her absence. She had memorized the path to the meadow so thoroughly that she could walk it with her eyes closed, her feet finding their way through the snow as if guided by some invisible force. And Luna was always there, waiting for her, a beacon of white against the gray winter landscape. During these frozen February days, Emma noticed something that worried her deeply. Luna was growing thin. The mare's ribs were beginning to show beneath her thick winter coat, and her movements had lost some of their usual grace. Emma understood with a child's simple logic that food must be scarce in the forest during such a brutal winter, that the grass was buried beneath feet of snow and the streams were frozen solid. She began to bring more food, stuffing her backpack until it could barely close, but she knew it was not enough. A horse as large as Luna needed far more sustenance than a 7-year-old girl could smuggle from her family's kitchen. One night, Emma lay awake in her bed, her mind racing with worry for her friend. She thought about telling her parents, about confessing everything and begging them to help. But she knew how that conversation would go. They would be angry that she had been sneaking off to meet a wild horse. They would be terrified of the danger she had put herself in. And worst of all, they would never understand the bond she shared with Luna. To them, the mare would always be the ghost of Willowbrook, a dangerous animal to be feared and avoided. They could never see her the way Emma did, as a gentle soul who simply needed someone to love her. So Emma devised a new plan. She began waking before dawn, when the house was still dark and quiet, to sneak extra food from the pantry. She took small amounts from different places, hoping her parents would not notice the gradual disappearance of oats and apples and the occasional loaf of bread. She hid these provisions in her backpack, which she kept under her bed, and carried them to Luna during her afternoon visits. The mare seemed to understand what Emma was doing for her, and her gratitude showed in the way she would rest her great head on the girl's shoulder, breathing warm air against her neck. As the weeks passed, the bond between them continued to deepen in ways that seemed almost magical. Luna began to follow Emma around the meadow, like a massive dog, her hooves making soft sounds in the snow as she walked beside the little girl. She would lower herself to the ground when Emma wanted to climb onto her back, a feat the girl had attempted only once before tumbling into a snowdrift, laughing at her own clumsiness. Luna had stood over her, nickering softly as if she too found the situation amusing, and from that moment on, Emma knew that this wild creature had become as tame as any house pet when it came to her. Emma's parents began to notice changes in their daughter that they could not explain. She seemed happier than she had ever been, but also more secretive. She would stare out the window toward the meadow with a dreamy expression on her face, and sometimes they would catch her talking to herself, as if practicing conversations for someone they could not see. Her mother worried that the long winter was affecting her daughter's imagination, while her father simply shrugged and said that all children went through strange phases. Neither of them suspected the truth that lived in Emma's heart. March brought the first hints of the spring that everyone in Willowbrook had been desperately awaiting. The days grew slightly longer, and occasionally the sun would break through the clouds with enough warmth to melt the top layer of snow. Emma's spirits lifted with the improving weather, and she began to dream of the days ahead, when she and Luna could explore the meadow together without the bitter cold driving them apart after only a few minutes. She imagined summer afternoons spent lying in the grass while Luna grazed nearby, picnics shared beneath the shade of the old oak tree at the meadow's edge. But March in Willowbrook was not to be trusted. The old-timers had a saying that winter always saved its worst for last, and this year would prove them right in the most terrifying way possible. The first 2 weeks of the month passed peacefully enough, with the snow gradually diminishing and the first brave birds returning to sing their songs in the morning. Emma's mother even allowed her to play outside for longer periods, believing that the worst of the cold had passed. It was a belief that would soon be proven tragically wrong. The storm came without warning on a Saturday afternoon in mid-March. Emma had been visiting Luna in the meadow, celebrating the warmer weather by staying longer than usual. The sky had been clear when she left the house, a brilliant blue that seemed to promise nothing but good things. But weather in the mountains was unpredictable, and by the time Emma noticed the clouds gathering on the horizon, it was already too late. The temperature dropped so quickly that her breath began to freeze in her nostrils, and the wind picked up with a violence that nearly knocked her off her feet. Luna stood beside her, her ears flat against her head and her eyes wide with concern. Emma knew she needed to get home immediately, but the world had transformed around her into a swirling chaos of white. The snow came not from above, but from every direction at once, driven by winds that screamed through the valley like tortured souls. Within minutes, Emma could not see more than a few feet in front of her face. The path home, which she had walked hundreds of times, had vanished beneath a blanket of white that made everything look the same. For the first time since she had begun her secret visits to the meadow, Emma felt a cold grip of fear wrap around her heart. The wind tore at Emma's coat with fingers of ice, and the snow stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She tried to walk in the direction she believed was home, but after only a few steps, she realized she had no idea which way she was going. The meadow had become a featureless white void, with no landmarks to guide her and no sun to show her the way. Panic rose in her chest, and she felt tears beginning to freeze on her cheeks before they could fall. She was lost, truly lost, in a storm that showed no signs of ending. Luna pressed close to her, the mare's massive body providing a small shelter from the relentless wind. Emma wrapped her arms around the horse's neck, burying her face in that thick silver mane that smelled of pine and winter air. She could feel Luna's heart beating, strong and steady, and she tried to match her own breathing to that comforting rhythm. But the cold was seeping through her coat, through her mittens, through every layer of protection her mother had so carefully dressed her in that morning. She knew with a child's terrible clarity that she was in serious danger. Back at the farmhouse, Emma's mother had noticed the storm rolling in and had called for her daughter to come inside. When no answer came, she assumed Emma was already on her way, perhaps playing in the barn or exploring the woodshed. It was only when the storm reached its full fury and Emma still had not appeared that panic began to set in. She ran through the house, calling her daughter's name, checking every room and closet and hiding spot she could think of. When the search proved fruitless, she threw open the back door and screamed into the howling wind, her voice swallowed by the storm before it could travel more than a few feet. Emma's father was still out in the forest when the storm hit. He had been cutting timber nearly 2 miles from home, and the sudden change in weather caught him completely off guard. He abandoned his equipment and began the long trudge back through the rapidly accumulating snow, his thoughts focused on reaching his family and making sure they were safe. He had no way of knowing that his daughter was at that very moment huddled in a meadow, clinging to a wild horse, while the temperature continued to plummet around them. In the meadow, Emma had stopped crying. The tears had frozen on her face and her body had begun to feel strangely warm, a sensation she did not understand but which frightened her nonetheless. She remembered her father telling her once about people who got lost in the snow, how they would start to feel warm just before the cold took them forever. The memory sent a fresh wave of terror through her small frame, and she hugged Luna tighter, whispering words that the wind snatched away before they could be heard. Luna stood motionless, her body positioned to block as much of the wind as possible from the little girl who clung to her. The mare's instincts, honed by years of surviving harsh winters in the wild, told her that they needed to find shelter. But she would not leave Emma, would not abandon this small human who had shown her kindness when no one else would. Instead, she began to move, slowly and carefully, nudging Emma to walk alongside her. The girl stumbled at first, her legs numb and uncooperative, But Luna was patient, waiting each time Emma faltered and gently pushing her forward when she was ready to continue. They walked for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably only minutes. Emma had no idea where Luna was leading her, but she trusted the mare completely, placing her frozen hands on that warm neck and letting herself be guided through the blinding white. The snow was up to her thighs now, and each step required an effort that seemed beyond her small body's capacity. But Luna was there, always there, her presence a constant reassurance that Emma was not alone. At the farmhouse, Emma's mother had descended into a state of frantic desperation. She had pulled on her husband's heavy coat and tried to venture out into the storm, but the wind had knocked her back before she could take more than a few steps. She stood at the window, her face pressed against the cold glass, praying with every fiber of her being that her daughter had found shelter somewhere, that she was safe and warm and would come walking through the door at any moment. But the storm raged on and Emma did not appear. When Emma's father finally made it home, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, he found his wife in tears. The news that Emma was missing hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and the strength from his legs. He wanted to run out into the storm immediately, to search every inch of the valley until he found his daughter, but he knew that would be suicide. The visibility was near zero, and the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Going out there would only mean 2 people lost instead of 1. So they waited, the longest and most agonizing wait of their lives. They held each other by the fire, praying and hoping and bargaining with God for the safe return of their only child. Emma's mother blamed herself for not watching more carefully, for not noticing sooner that her daughter was gone. Emma's father blamed himself for being so far from home when his family needed him most. The guilt and fear mingled with the howling of the wind outside, creating a symphony of suffering that neither of them would ever forget. Miles away, in a part of the forest that Emma had never explored, Luna had found what she was looking for. A small cave, really more of an indentation in the rocky hillside, provided shelter from the worst of the wind. The mare guided Emma inside, pushing her gently with her nose until the girl was pressed against the back wall, protected from the elements. Then Luna did something remarkable. She lay down in the opening of the cave, her massive body blocking the entrance completely, creating a living barrier between Emma and the deadly storm outside. Emma curled against Luna's warm belly, her small body finally beginning to thaw in the shelter the mare had provided. She could feel the horse's heart beating beneath that thick coat, a steady rhythm that seemed to say everything would be all right. Her eyes grew heavy, and despite the fear that still lingered in her mind, she felt herself beginning to drift towards sleep. Luna turned her great head and rested it gently on Emma's legs, and the little girl reached out to stroke that soft muzzle one more time before darkness claimed her. The storm raged through the night, burying Willowbrook beneath a fresh blanket of white that would take weeks to fully melt. The wind screamed through the valley like a wounded animal, tearing branches from trees and piling snow into drifts that reached the rooftops of the smaller buildings. It was the kind of storm that old-timers would talk about for years to come, the kind that claimed lives and changed families forever. And somewhere in the heart of that frozen fury, a little girl slept peacefully against the warm body of a wild horse who had chosen to save her. Emma's parents did not sleep that night. They sat together by the fire, jumping at every sound, praying that each gust of wind would bring their daughter stumbling through the door. Emma's mother had cried until she had no tears left, and now she simply stared at the flames with hollow eyes, her mind playing out every terrible scenario that could have befallen her child. Emma's father paced the floor, his hands clenched into fists, cursing himself for his helplessness and the storm that held him prisoner in his own home. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the wind had finally died down to a whisper. The snow had stopped falling, and the world outside was transformed into a landscape of pristine white, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Emma's father was out the door before his wife could say a word, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder as he waded toward the barn to retrieve snowshoes and supplies. He would find his daughter or die trying. Word spread quickly through the small community of Willowbrook. By mid-morning, a search party had assembled at the general store, more than 24 men and women bundled in their warmest clothes and armed with ropes and blankets and thermoses of hot coffee. Old Tom, who knew the valley better than anyone alive, took charge of organizing the effort, dividing the searchers into groups and assigning each one a section of the wilderness to cover. Emma's father led the group that would search the meadows behind his property, his heart telling him that his daughter would be found somewhere in the direction she loved to wander. In the cave, Emma stirred awake to a world of surprising warmth. For a moment, she did not remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding with renewed fear. But Luna was still there, her great body blocking the entrance to the cave, her dark eyes watching Emma with a calm intelligence that seemed to say everything was going to be all right. The storm had passed, and pale winter sunlight was filtering around the mare's white form, making her glow like something from a fairy tale. Emma was cold and hungry, and more frightened than she had ever been in her young life. But she was alive. She crawled toward Luna and wrapped her arms around the horse's neck, burying her face in that silver mane and whispering words of gratitude that came straight from her heart. Luna nickered softly in response, her warm breath washing over Emma's frozen cheeks like a gentle kiss. They stayed like that for a long moment, girl and horse bound together by a love that had transcended all boundaries. But Emma knew she could not stay in the cave forever. Her parents would be worried sick, and she needed to find her way home before the cold claimed her after all. The problem was that she had no idea where she was. Luna had led her through the storm to this shelter, but the journey had been a blur of white and wind, and Emma could not retrace her steps even if she wanted to. She looked at Luna, and an idea began to form in her mind. The mare had saved her once. Perhaps she could save her again. Luna seemed to understand what Emma needed. The great horse rose to her feet, shaking the snow from her coat, and stepped out of the cave entrance. She stood there for a moment, her head raised and her nostrils flaring as she tested the wind. Then she looked back at Emma with an expression that clearly said, "Follow me." The little girl did not hesitate. She climbed out of the cave and took hold of Luna's mane, trusting the mare to lead her home just as she had trusted her to find shelter from the storm. The search party had been combing the wilderness for hours without success. Emma's father was beginning to lose hope, his voice growing hoarse from calling his daughter's name and his legs aching from wading through the deep snow. He had searched every hollow and every thicket he could find, but there was no sign of Emma anywhere. The other searchers were reporting similar failures, their voices crackling over the handheld radios with news that was always the same. Nothing. No trace. No clues. Then someone spotted movement in the distance. It was Mrs. Patterson, the church lady who had been assigned to search the northern ridge, and her voice came through the radio with an excitement that made everyone stop in their tracks. She was seeing something coming out of the tree line, something white and large that was moving slowly through the snow. At first she thought it was a deer, but as it drew closer, she realized with a shock that it was a horse. Not just any horse, but the ghost of Willowbrook herself, and there was something small walking beside her, clinging to her mane. The news spread through the search party like wildfire. Emma's father dropped everything and began to run, his snowshoes carrying him across the frozen landscape with desperate speed. Other searchers fell in behind him, and soon a small crowd was converging on the spot where Mrs. Patterson had seen the horse emerge from the forest. Emma's father was praying with every step, making promises to God that he would keep for the rest of his life if only his daughter was safe and whole. And then he saw her, his little girl, his Emma, walking through the snow beside the largest horse he had ever seen. She looked exhausted and cold, her face pale and her lips slightly blue, but she was alive. She was alive. A sob tore from his throat, and he covered the remaining distance in what seemed like a single bound, sweeping his daughter into his arms and holding her so tightly that she could barely breathe. Emma clung to him, crying and laughing at the same time, and for a long moment, nothing else in the world mattered. The searchers gathered around Emma and her father, their faces a mixture of relief and astonishment. Many of them had known this child since she was born, had watched her grow from a tiny infant into the bright-eyed girl who now stood before them, and the thought of losing her had been almost too much to bear. But it was not just Emma who commanded their attention. Standing a few yards away, watching the reunion with those deep, intelligent eyes, was the ghost of Willowbrook herself. The mare that had terrified hunters and inspired legends was now regarding the crowd with a calm dignity that seemed almost regal. Old Tom was the first to find his voice. He had lived in Willowbrook for 73 years and had heard every story ever told about the wild white mare. He had always dismissed most of them as exaggerations, the kind of tall tales that grew taller with each telling. But what he was seeing now defied everything he thought he knew. The ghost was not running. She was not rearing or screaming or showing any of the aggression that the stories described. She was simply standing there, as if waiting to make sure that the little girl she had saved was truly safe. Emma's father finally released his daughter from his embrace, though he kept one hand firmly on her shoulder, as if afraid she might disappear again. He looked at the white mare with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and confusion. He had heard the stories about the ghost just like everyone else. He had warned Emma countless times to stay away from wild animals, to never approach horses she did not know. And yet here was the most dangerous horse in the valley, the creature that everyone feared, standing peacefully in the snow after apparently saving his daughter's life. Emma saw her father looking at Luna, and her heart began to race with a new kind of fear. She had kept her friendship with the mare secret for so long, terrified of how the adults would react. Now that secret was exposed, and she did not know what would happen next. Would they try to capture Luna? Would they drive her away? The thought of losing her friend after everything they had been through together was almost worse than the storm itself. But before anyone could speak, Luna made a decision of her own. The mare walked slowly toward Emma, her hooves crunching softly in the snow, ignoring the nervous murmurs of the crowd around her. When she reached the little girl, she lowered her great head and pressed her muzzle against Emma's cheek, in a gesture so tender that several of the searchers felt tears spring to their eyes. Emma reached up and stroked Luna's face, whispering words that only the two of them could hear. Emma's father watched this exchange with growing amazement. He was not a man who believed in miracles or fairy tales, but what he was witnessing seemed to be both at once. His daughter, his 7-year-old little girl, had somehow formed a bond with a wild horse that defied all logic and reason. And that horse had saved Emma's life, had protected her through a storm that could have easily killed them both. He did not understand it, but he knew in his heart that he could never repay the debt he owed to this magnificent creature. The journey back to the farmhouse was slow and surreal. Emma walked beside Luna, refusing to let go of her mane despite her father's gentle suggestions that she ride on the rescue sled they had brought. The other searchers kept their distance from the mare, still wary despite what they had witnessed, but their fear was gradually being replaced by something closer to wonder. By the time they reached the edge of the meadow behind Emma's home, the story of what had happened was already taking shape, destined to become the most remarkable tale Willowbrook had ever known. Emma's mother came running from the house the moment she saw the group approaching. She had been waiting by the window for hours, too anxious to join the search party, but too terrified to do anything else. When she saw Emma walking through the snow, alive and apparently unharmed, she let out a cry that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She ran through the snow in her house slippers, not caring about the cold, and swept her daughter into an embrace that lifted the little girl off her feet. For several minutes, there was nothing but crying and laughter, and the kind of raw emotion that only comes from facing the unthinkable and being granted a reprieve. Emma's parents held their daughter between them, touching her face and her hair as if to confirm that she was real, that this was not some cruel dream from which they would soon awaken. The searchers stood at a respectful distance, giving the family their moment of reunion while keeping one eye on the white mare who had made it all possible. Luna remained at the edge of the meadow, watching the scene with her characteristic stillness. She had done what she came to do, had delivered her small friend safely back to her family. Now she seemed uncertain, as if waiting for some signal that would tell her what happened next. Emma noticed the mare's hesitation and pulled away from her parents, turning to look at the friend who had saved her life. "Mama, Papa," Emma said, her voice hoarse but determined. "This is Luna. She saved me. She kept me warm all night and brought me home. Please do not let anyone hurt her." The plea in Emma's voice was unmistakable, and her parents exchanged a glance that communicated more than words ever could. They had 1,000 questions, but those could wait. Right now, all that mattered was that their daughter was safe and that the creature responsible for that miracle was still standing in their meadow, waiting to see how the humans would respond. Emma's father stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He had spent his whole life around animals, and he knew that trust was something that had to be earned. He stopped several feet away from Luna and simply stood there, letting the mare assess him on her own terms. Luna's ears flicked forward and she stretched her neck toward him, sniffing the air cautiously. Then, in a moment that made everyone hold their breath, she took a single step closer. It was not much, but it was enough. Emma's father understood that this wild creature was extending an olive branch, offering the possibility of something that had never existed before. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a sacred pact, and turned back to his family with tears glistening in his eyes. The days that followed Emma's rescue were unlike anything Willowbrook had ever experienced. News of what had happened spread through the valley like wildfire, passed from neighbor to neighbor, with each retelling growing more detailed and more wondrous. The story of the little girl who had befriended the ghost of Willowbrook and been saved by her during the worst storm in memory captured the imagination of everyone who heard it. People who had feared the white mare for years now spoke of her with a reverence that bordered on the mystical. Emma spent the first 2 days after her ordeal in bed, recovering from the exposure and exhaustion that had nearly claimed her young life. The doctor from town made the long journey to examine her, pronouncing her remarkably healthy considering what she had been through. "A few more hours in that cold," he said gravely, "and we would be having a very different conversation." Emma's parents shuddered at his words, their gratitude toward Luna deepening with every reminder of how close they had come to losing their daughter. But even as she recovered, Emma's thoughts were constantly with Luna. She would lie in her bed beneath the warm quilt, staring out the window toward the meadow, wondering if her friend was still there or if she had retreated back into the wilderness. Her mother, noticing her daughter's preoccupation, would offer reassurances that Luna was fine, that wild horses knew how to take care of themselves. But Emma knew something her mother did not. Luna was not just any wild horse. She was a friend, a companion, a soulmate in the truest sense of the word. On the 3rd day, Emma felt well enough to venture outside. Her parents were hesitant at first, worried that she might catch a chill or tire herself out. But they could see the desperation in their daughter's eyes, the need to reconnect with the creature who had saved her life. So they bundled her up in every warm garment they could find and walked with her to the edge of the meadow, prepared to support whatever happened next. Luna was there, waiting. She stood in the same spot where they had parted 3 days earlier, as if she had never left. When she saw Emma approaching, She let out a soft nicker that carried across the frozen air like a song. Emma broke away from her parents and ran through the snow, her earlier weakness forgotten in the joy of the moment. She threw her arms around Luna's neck, and the mare lowered her head to rest it gently on the girl's shoulder, and for a long moment they simply held each other in an embrace that transcended species. Emma's parents watched the reunion, with tears streaming down their faces. They had doubted, they had worried, they had feared what this relationship between their daughter and a wild animal might mean. But seeing them together now, seeing the obvious love that flowed between them, all those concerns melted away like snow in springtime. This was not dangerous. This was not reckless. This was something pure and beautiful, a connection that most people would never be fortunate enough to experience. From that day forward, everything changed. Emma's secret was no longer a secret, and there was no need for her to sneak away to visit Luna. Her parents gave their blessing for the friendship, asking only that Emma be careful and that she never venture into the forest alone. Luna, for her part, seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. She began to come closer to the farmhouse, grazing in the meadow during the day and sometimes even approaching the fence that marked the boundary of Emma's yard. The people of Willowbrook reacted to the story in different ways. Some were skeptical, dismissing the tale as exaggeration or coincidence. Others were frightened, warning Emma's parents that they were making a mistake by allowing a wild animal so close to their home. But most were simply awed, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary that would be remembered long after they were all gone. Old Tom became one of Luna's most vocal defenders. He would tell anyone who would listen about the day the ghost saved Emma, embellishing the story with each telling until the mare had grown to twice her actual size and the storm had become a once-in-a-century blizzard. But beneath the exaggerations lay a truth that everyone could see. Luna was not the monster they had imagined. She was a protector, a guardian, a friend to a little girl who had been brave enough to see past her fearsome reputation. As winter slowly released its grip on the valley, Emma and Luna's bond continued to strengthen. The girl would spend hours in the meadow with her friend, talking to her about everything and nothing while Luna listened with those wise, patient eyes. Sometimes Emma would climb onto Luna's back, and the mare would walk slowly around the meadow, carrying her precious cargo with a gentleness that belied her enormous size. Other times they would simply stand together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emma's parents found themselves drawn into the relationship as well. Her father, initially the most skeptical, became one of Luna's greatest admirers. He would bring her apples from the cellar and stand at a respectful distance while she ate, marveling at her beauty and power. Her mother, always the more emotional of the two, would sometimes join Emma in the meadow, sitting on a blanket and reading while her daughter and the white mare wandered together through the melting snow. The other children in Willowbrook were fascinated by Emma's friendship with Luna. They would gather at the fence whenever they could, watching the little girl and the massive horse with wide eyes and whispered conversations. Some were jealous, wishing they could have a friend as magnificent as the ghost. Others were simply amazed, unable to comprehend how the shyest girl in their school had accomplished something that seemed impossible. Emma, who had always felt like an outsider, suddenly found herself at the center of attention in a way she had never expected. But through it all, Emma remained humble. She knew that her friendship with Luna was not something she had earned through courage or skill. It was a gift, pure and simple, one that had been given to her because she had been willing to see beyond appearances and offer kindness to a creature that the world had rejected. That gift had saved her life, and she would spend the rest of her days being grateful for it. Spring arrived in Willowbrook with a gentleness that seemed designed to heal the wounds of winter. The snow melted gradually, revealing patches of brown earth that would soon burst into green. Streams that had been frozen solid began to flow again, their cheerful babbling a welcome replacement for the howling winds that had dominated the valley for so long. Birds returned in growing numbers, filling the air with songs that spoke of renewal and hope. And in the meadow behind Emma's farmhouse, a little girl and a white mare greeted each new day together. Emma had turned 8 in April, and her birthday party had been the most memorable in Willowbrook's history. Not because of the cake her mother had baked or the presents her relatives had brought, but because of the guest of honor who had appeared at the edge of the meadow just as the children were singing. Luna had stood there watching, her white coat gleaming in the spring sunshine, and every child at the party had fallen silent in wonder. Emma had excused herself and walked over to her friend, and the two of them had shared a moment that the other children would talk about for years to come. As the weeks passed and the weather grew warmer, Luna began to change in ways that surprised everyone. The mare, who had once fled from all human contact, now tolerated the presence of Emma's parents and even some of the neighbors who came to catch a glimpse of the famous ghost. She would never let anyone but Emma touch her, maintaining a dignified distance from all other humans. But the fear and aggression that had defined her reputation seemed to have vanished completely. It was as if Emma's love had transformed her, softening the hard edges that years of isolation had created. The transformation went both ways. Emma, who had always been quiet and withdrawn, blossomed under the influence of her extraordinary friendship. She spoke more confidently in class, made friends more easily with the other children, and carried herself with a new sense of purpose that her parents found both beautiful and slightly bittersweet. Their little girl was growing up, and the wild horse in the meadow was somehow part of that journey. One afternoon in late May, something happened that would add another chapter to the legend of Emma and Luna. A group of men had come to Willowbrook from the city, representatives of some wildlife organization that had heard about the famous white mare. They arrived with trucks and equipment and official-looking documents, explaining to anyone who would listen that wild horses were a nuisance that needed to be managed. They spoke of relocation programs and population control, using words that sounded reasonable but carried an undertone of threat. Emma's father met them at the edge of his property, his arms crossed and his expression unwelcoming. He listened to their explanations and examined their paperwork, but his answer was firm and final. "That horse is not a nuisance," he told them. "She is a hero, and she is under the protection of this family and this community. You are welcome to leave the same way you came." The men protested, citing regulations and authorities and consequences, but Emma's father did not budge. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Willowbrook. By evening, a small crowd had gathered at Emma's farmhouse, neighbors and friends who had come to show their support. Old Tom gave a speech about the ghost and how she had saved little Emma, his voice cracking with emotion as he described the moment they had found the girl walking out of the forest with the white mare at her side. Mrs. Patterson read a passage from the Bible about animals and their place in God's creation. Even the children contributed, holding signs they had made with crayons and construction paper that read things like "Save Luna" and "Horses are heroes." The men from the city watched this display with growing discomfort. They had expected a simple operation, a routine removal of a problematic animal. They had not expected to encounter a community united in defense of a wild horse, led by a little girl whose story had touched hearts across the entire valley. After a hushed conversation among themselves, they packed up their equipment and drove away, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks in the soft spring mud. Emma watched them go from her spot in the meadow, Luna standing beside her like a faithful guardian. She had been frightened when she first heard about the men and their plans, terrified that someone would take her friend away. But seeing her community come together, seeing her father stand up for Luna the way she herself had done so many months ago, filled her with a pride and gratitude that words could not express. Luna was safe, and she would remain safe, because Willowbrook had claimed her as one of their own. That night, Emma's parents sat her down for a conversation they had been putting off for weeks. They explained that Luna was a wild creature, free and independent, and that she might not always stay in the meadow. Wild horses roamed, they said gently. They followed the seasons and their instincts, and there might come a day when Luna felt called to return to the mountains from which she had come. They wanted Emma to understand this, to be prepared for the possibility that her friend might one day choose to leave. Emma listened to her parents with a maturity that surprised them both. She had thought about this herself, lying awake at night and wondering what the future held for her and Luna. But she had come to a peace with the uncertainty, accepting that love did not mean possession and that friendship did not require constant presence. Luna had given her so much already. She had taught her courage and compassion, had saved her life, and changed her heart. Whatever happened next, those gifts would remain forever. When her parents finished speaking, Emma hugged them both and thanked them for their honesty. Then she went to her window and looked out at the meadow, where Luna stood bathed in moonlight like a creature from a dream. The mare seemed to sense her gaze and turned her head toward the farmhouse, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. In that look was everything they had shared and everything they had yet to share, a bond that time and distance could never break. Summer stretched out before them like a promise, full of long days and warm nights and adventures waiting to be had. Emma smiled and whispered goodnight to her friend, then climbed into bed and fell asleep, dreaming of meadows and mountains and a magnificent white horse who had taught her what it meant to truly love. Summer in Willowbrook was a season of abundance and joy. The meadows burst into carpets of wild flowers, painting the valley in shades of purple and yellow and brilliant white. The streams ran full and clear, their waters cold from the mountain snowmelt that fed them. Children ran barefoot through the fields, their laughter echoing off the surrounding peaks, while their parents tended gardens and prepared for the harvest that would sustain them through the coming winter. It was a time of plenty, a time of peace, and for Emma, it was the happiest season of her young life. She spent every possible moment with Luna, their friendship deepening with each passing day. They would wander through the meadow together in the early morning when the dew still clung to the grass and the world felt fresh and new. They would rest in the shade of the old oak tree during the heat of the afternoon, Emma reading aloud from her favorite books while Luna dozed peacefully beside her. And in the evenings, as the sun painted the sky in its farewell colors, they would stand together at the edge of the forest, watching the light fade and feeling the profound connection that needed no words to express. Luna had grown sleek and healthy during the months since the storm. Regular feeding and the absence of fear had transformed her into an even more magnificent creature than before. Her coat gleamed like polished silver in the sunlight, and her mane flowed like water when she ran. She moved with a grace and power that took Emma's breath away, and sometimes the little girl would simply stand and watch her friend gallop across the meadow, marveling at the beauty of this wild creature who had chosen to share her life with a human child. But as the summer wore on, Emma began to notice changes in Luna's behavior. The mare would sometimes stand at the edge of the meadow, staring toward the distant mountains with an intensity that made Emma's heart ache. She would lift her head when the wind carried scents from the forest, her nostrils flaring and her ears pricked forward, as if listening to a call that only she could hear. Emma recognized these signs for what they were. Luna's wild heart was stirring, responding to instincts that ran deeper than any bond forged with humans. Emma's parents noticed the changes too, and they watched their daughter with growing concern. They knew that the conversation they had started in the spring might soon need to continue, that the day they had warned Emma about might be approaching faster than any of them had hoped. But they also saw how happy their daughter was, how the summer sun had brought color to her cheeks and light to her eyes, and they could not bring themselves to cast shadows over her joy. August arrived with heat that shimmered off the fields and humidity that hung in the air like a wet blanket. The streams ran lower than they had in June, and the flowers that had been so vibrant began to wilt and fade. It was during this transitional time, when summer was preparing to yield to autumn, that something happened which would test the bond between Emma and Luna in ways neither could have anticipated. A wildfire had broken out in the mountains to the north, sparked by lightning during a dry thunderstorm. The flames spread quickly through the parched forest, driving animals before them in a panicked exodus. Deer and elk streamed down from the high country, followed by bears and mountain lions and creatures that normally avoided human settlements at all costs. The smoke hung over Willowbrook like a gray shroud, and the air tasted of ash and fear. Luna became increasingly agitated as the fire drew closer. She paced the meadow endlessly, her eyes wild and her body tense with an anxiety that Emma had never seen in her before. The mare refused to eat, refused to be calmed by Emma's gentle words and soothing touches. Something primal had awakened in her, some ancient instinct that screamed at her to flee from the danger that was consuming the mountain she called home. Emma stayed with Luna through those terrible days, talking to her constantly and trying to provide whatever comfort she could. She understood what her friend was going through, could feel the fear and confusion radiating from that powerful body. But she also sensed something else beneath the fear, something that made her heart heavy with a sadness she could not name. Luna was being called back to the wild, summoned by forces greater than the love they shared. The firefighters managed to contain the blaze before it reached Willowbrook, and gradually the smoke began to clear, and the displaced animals returned to their mountain homes. But Luna did not settle back into her peaceful routine. She continued to watch the mountains with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Emma knew with a certainty that broke her heart that their time together was coming to an end. One evening in late August, as the first hints of autumn touched the air, Emma walked to the meadow and found Luna standing at the very edge of the forest. The mare turned to look at her as she approached, and in that gaze was everything they had shared and everything they were about to lose. Emma walked slowly forward, her eyes blurring with tears she refused to let fall, and stopped a few feet away from her beloved friend. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath around them, honoring the weight of this farewell. Then Luna stepped forward and lowered her great head, pressing her muzzle against Emma's chest in a gesture so tender that it finally broke the dam holding back the girl's tears. Emma wrapped her arms around that powerful neck and sobbed, pouring out all the love and gratitude and grief that filled her small heart. Luna stood perfectly still, accepting Emma's embrace and offering what comfort she could. When the tears finally subsided, the mare pulled back and looked into Emma's eyes one last time. In that look was a promise, an assurance that what they had shared would never truly end. Then Luna turned and walked toward the forest, her silver form growing smaller with each step until she disappeared among the trees. Emma watched until long after she was gone, standing alone in the meadow as the stars emerged overhead. Her heart was broken, but it was also full. She had loved a wild creature, and that creature had loved her back. Nothing could ever take that away. The seasons turned in Willowbrook as they always had, indifferent to the joys and sorrows of those who lived within the valley's embrace. Autumn came with its brilliant colors and crisp mornings, followed by winter with its familiar blanket of white. Spring brought renewal, and summer brought warmth, and through it all, Emma grew from a child into a young woman who carried in her heart the memory of a friendship that had changed her forever. She never stopped visiting the meadow. Even when months passed without a glimpse of silver among the trees, even when the other children forgot about the ghost and moved on to other wonders, Emma remained faithful, She would walk to the edge of the forest and stand there in silence, remembering the warmth of Luna's breath on her cheek and the steady rhythm of that great heart beating beneath her ear. Sometimes she brought apples and left them at the tree line, returning the next day to find them gone and choosing to believe that Luna had been the one to take them. Emma's parents watched their daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. They had feared that Luna's departure would devastate her, that the loss of her beloved friend would plunge her into a grief from which she might never recover. But Emma surprised them, as she had surprised them so many times before. She mourned, yes, and there were nights when they could hear her crying softly in her room. But she did not break. She carried her sadness with a grace that seemed beyond her years, transforming it into something beautiful rather than letting it consume her. As Emma grew older, she became known throughout Willowbrook as someone special. Not because of her famous friendship with the ghost, though that story was still told around firesides and dinner tables across the valley. She was special because of the kindness she showed to every creature she encountered, the patience she extended to animals that others had given up on, and the quiet wisdom she had gained from loving something wild and learning to let it go. People brought her injured birds and orphaned fawns, abandoned kittens and dogs that had been left on the roadside, and Emma cared for them all with the same gentle devotion she had once shown Luna. Years passed, and Emma became a young woman of 17. She had grown tall and strong with the same honey-colored eyes and chestnut hair she had possessed as a child, though now that hair fell past her shoulders instead of being braided by her mother each morning. She was finishing her final year of school and making plans to study veterinary medicine at the university in the city. Her dream was to return to Willowbrook someday and open an animal sanctuary, a place where creatures like Luna could find refuge and healing. It was on a crisp October evening, 10 years after Luna had walked into the forest and out of her daily life, that Emma made her way to the meadow one final time before leaving for university. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away. She stood at the edge of the forest, as she had stood so many times before, and let the memories wash over her like waves upon a shore. She thought about the frightened little girl she had been, sneaking food from her mother's kitchen to feed a wild horse that everyone else feared. She thought about the storm and the cave, and the miracle of waking up warm and alive against Luna's belly. She thought about the summer they had shared, those golden days of wandering through wildflowers and dreaming beneath the ancient oak. And she thought about the farewell, that heartbreaking moment when Luna had looked into her eyes and then turned away, answering a call that no human could ever fully understand. Emma closed her eyes and whispered into the evening air, "Thank you, Luna, for everything, for saving my life, for teaching me how to love, for showing me that the wildest hearts can be the gentlest and that true friendship knows no boundaries. Wherever you are, I hope you are free and happy. I hope you remember me the way I will always remember you." When she opened her eyes, she saw her. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a white mare who gleamed like moonlight made solid. Luna was older now, her muzzle touched with gray, and her movements slower than they had been in her youth. But those eyes were the same, dark and deep and filled with an intelligence that had always seemed almost human. And beside her, pressing close to her flank, stood a young foal with a coat as white as freshly fallen snow. Emma's heart stopped. She could not move, could not breathe, could barely believe what she was seeing. Luna watched her for a long moment, and in that gaze was everything they had ever shared, and everything they would carry forward into whatever came next. Then the mare stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and lowered her head to rest it gently against Emma's shoulder, just as she had done so many years ago. The tears came then, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Emma wrapped her arms around Luna's neck and held her close, feeling the steady beat of that beloved heart and knowing that some bonds truly were eternal. The foal watched curiously, unafraid of this human who smelled of love and kindness. And when Emma finally released Luna and knelt down, the young horse approached her without hesitation. Luna had brought her child to meet the girl who had once saved her, the human who had taught her that not all two-legged creatures were to be feared. It was a gift beyond measure, a testament to a friendship that had transcended time and distance and the boundaries between wild and tame. Emma understood this, and her gratitude was too vast for words. As darkness fell over Willowbrook and the stars emerged to witness this reunion, Emma walked back toward the farmhouse with a heart overflowing with wonder. Behind her, Luna and her foal watched from the meadow, two silver shapes against the gathering night. Some stories, Emma realized, do not truly end. They simply continue in ways we never expected, weaving through our lives like threads of light that connect us to something greater than ourselves. And in Willowbrook, the legend of the little girl and the wild white mare lived on, inspiring all who heard it to believe in the extraordinary power of love. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and leave a comment telling me how it made you feel. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from and whether you enjoy these heartwarming animal stories. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of courage, friendship, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, may you always find the courage to love something wild.